Okay, guys, so we're going to take a look at from the Declaration of Independence to the end of the Revolutionary War, how the colonists or patriots are going to be able to obtain their independence. So looking at the time frame of 1776 to 1783. Now, first off, understanding the two sides within the colonies. You have loyalists on one hand. Loyalists are those who remain loyal to Great Britain. They oppose independence. Many loyalists come from very different backgrounds. Majority of the colonists within the colonies were loyalists. They did not necessarily have a will within the fight, and they were concerned about what the aftermath of the war would look like. Oftentimes their loyalty was tied to their jobs. Some of them have been appointed by British officers or by the monarch, and so they didn't want to lose their political position. Some of them also conducted trade and were quite lucrative with their trade, particularly in the southern colonies. Some had a strong sense and connection to England because of their faith with the Anglican Church. So there are going to be multiple ties that keep the loyalists tied to Great Britain. Many also believe that Great Britain was inevitably going to win this conflict. There was no way that a small group of patriots, none who had ever been trained as soldiers or who have any military training to lead such soldiers, were going to be a match for the great British army. And so they feared that it was ultimately going to be a British victory, and they didn't want to be labeled as rebels for fear of revenge or repercussions after the war. They also, in general, thought that the monarch, while it had its faults, was a far better government than the potential of what the colonial governments could look like. While there were these ideas of independence and a self-governing type of country, there was a growing concern that the colonial governments would not be able to meet the needs of the citizens within the colonies. They felt that their rights would be better protected by the well-established monarchs. Now, on the other side of this are the patriots, those who do want to fight for their independence. Many of the patriots make up the minority of the population in the colonies, but the patriots see this as an opportunity, mostly as an economic opportunity for an independent America. So this is your merchants. This is why a lot of the causes to the war were taking place in New England, where a lot of the manufacturing and self-sufficient systems were established. You do have some farmers, so while the South was mostly loyalists, you will have members that are supportive of the era of independence. The middle colonies with your artisans and your merchants will also have some examples of patriot members. Now, looking at the advantages and disadvantages of either side, within the United States and amongst the patriots, they do have some strengths or an upper hand against the British. One is the homeland advantage. They know their terrain. A lot of the battles are going to be conducted in the wilderness, and so the colonies use their knowledge of the wilderness and their small streams, creeks, and river systems to be able to maneuver their troops and supplies and conduct ambush attacks on the British. They also have amazing leaders. Some of the military, like George Washington, underestimating the strategy that George Washington is going to use to have an upper hand against the British when he is undermanned, undergunned, and undersupplied. But also the ability of some of our political leaders. Benjamin Franklin's going to prove to be a great diplomat for the Patriots, as he's going to be the one to bring the French in on the colonist side. Also, the really main factor here, the key strength for the colonists, is the fact that they have a moral cause. In this conflict, they have something that they are fighting for. They're fighting for their independence. And they realized by, the founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence, they were signing their death warrant. So if they don't win, they face treason, which means death. So it gives them the motivation to keep going. But ultimately, the colonists are going to have their weaknesses as well. Their soldiers were untrained, had no discipline. Many of them had never even fought before. Many hadn't even fired a gun. So the lack of training and organization will be evident. Also, the shortage of food and supplies. One of the first things that the British does is form a blockade around the colonies. So nothing can get in or get out. So they're not making any money. They can't get supplies from other countries. And the network amongst the colonies is going to be extremely weak. Again, no Navy, so they can't even combat against the British blockade. They just have to try to endure it and be able to survive. Ultimately, the French Navy will come to their rescue. The other weakness for the colonies, which is kind of interesting as we will see the development of the country later, is the fact that they have no central government. While there is the Continental Congress, there's representation of each of the colonies, but those representatives aren't necessarily trusting of one another yet. There's not this idea that they're going to work together. So each representative is out there for the interests of their own colony. So South Carolina is concerned about South Carolinian soldiers. They're going to want to make sure that their food, their supplies, their money goes to support the South Carolinian troops, not the Continental Army as a whole, which is going to be a struggle. Now, on the other side of this are the British, and a lot of the weaknesses of the colonists are the strengths of the British. So, for example, they have a very well-trained and organized army and navy. They have a strong central government, a monarch with plenty of money, and if they were to run out of money, have enough credit to be able to borrow money to continue their conflict. They also have the support of the Loyalists and the Native Americans. Now, the Native Americans are looking at this conflict in, a different perspective. It's not that the natives trust Great Britain, but they fear that the colonists, if they have control of the region, will end up taking more land. The Proclamation of 1763 actually gave hope to the Native Americans that the British would honor their land holdings and keep the colonists away. So they're going to throw their support to Great Britain. Now, some of the weaknesses for the British is the fact that they are so far away from their monarch and from their supply source. So that 3,000-mile trek is going to prove difficult. Also, the troops are unfamiliar with their terrain. They don't know the wilderness, they don't know the local roads or the local river systems, and so those ambush attacks are going to be very costly towards the British. They're weak military leaders. Now, the weak leadership isn't in their ability. I mean, these are well-trained generals. However, the weakness in the military leaders is their approach to the colonists. They underestimate their ability and their willingness to fight. Also, there will be some sympathy by British politicians towards the American cause, especially in regards to the lack of representation that the British colonies have within Parliament. So, looking at some of the strategic battles after the Declaration of Independence, it's going to be slow moving for the colonists. They had some early hopes, some morale boosters with Lexington and Concord, and even the morale booster of Bunker Hill. Even though they lost Bunker Hill, it proved that they could withstand the fight. But their supplies are going to start to get less and less, and the British are going to strategically capture major cities. With Boston closed off, New York becomes the next target. And so when the British capture New York City and the colony of New York, that is a huge blow to the colonists and their ability to conduct trade or even try to smuggle goods in or out. So the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 is going to be key because this is where the British really try to take on the offensive and start going out of their elements of comfort. So Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne is going to take some British troops through New York, trying to capture the capital city of Albany by way of Canada. So they're going to march up from Massachusetts and Maine, what is present-day Maine, in through Canada and down around the Great Lakes to hit into the western part of New York to be able to try to seize that territory and have full control of New York. The concern here is, and the challenge is, the traveling through the wilderness with all of his supplies. The British were not used to, quote, roughing it. So they're going to have supplies that aren't necessarily of necessity. I mean, Burgoyne had wine and expensive food and fine luxuries and clothing that he was bringing by wagon. And again, this is where the strength of the colonies comes into play because they know the wilderness and the British don't. So they're going to be able to conduct ambush attacks. So Burgoyne was constantly attacked on his trip by the colonial militia all over New York and New England. So while they never had a direct man-to-man battle, the colonists were able to pick off supplies, and they could use the supplies that they stole to replenish their troops and continue to conduct those ambush attacks. So by the time Burgoyne gets towards western New York, his supplies were extremely low, and he wasn't going to be able to receive reinforcements. And so he's going to have to make do with what he has. And so this is where the colonists, finally weakening the British, conduct a man-to-man battle, and they have Burgoyne surrounded and forcing him to surrender in Saratoga, New York. So This is why Saratoga is considered the turning point of the war as things turn around for the colonists, because the British were no longer going to send troops into the countryside. It was far too costly to them in supplies and also men, and also being able to gain ground. They kind of changed the momentum in towards the colonists' way. So they're going to stay close to the coastline and stay close to their supply ships, which means we now have the British kind of contained to a certain area. It also proved the colonists were a force to be reckoned with. While they may not have the numbers or the sophisticated training or resources, they have their knowledge of the terrain, and they also have their motivation to try to be able to survive. So, huge confidence blow to the British, and this also sparked the interest of the French. This was the victory the French needed to see to say, all right, we are going to commit to the colonists. So this is going to strengthen their support to the point that France will officially recognize the colonies as an independent country in North America. And so start sending supplies and troops to reinforce the colonists. Those supplies are going to be heavily needed as winter starts to set in 1777. So that same year of that great victory in Saratoga is also going to be one of the biggest struggles for the Continental Army as they take camp in Valley Forge, which is in Pennsylvania. That winter was a particularly harsh winter. The British were nearby, living comfortably in Philadelphia, so they had taken over that major city and occupying that and living amongst the Loyalists in a very comfortable, warm setting. While George Washington and his troops are going to be stuck in a very quick put-together camp that is not going to be prepared for the harsh winter that's about to set in. Valley Forge in 1777 was proving how difficult it was for the Continental Congress to get supplies to their troops. Their troops, the Continental Army, hadn't been paid in quite some time, so their families are having to do without. 10,000 soldiers make camp in Valley Forge, but they're battling against the wind, snow, and ice. Their clothes are tattered. There's very few blankets. There's very little food. So the morale amongst the troops is very, very low. They have to try to make do with what they have. So they take scrap wood, they take clay, anything to try to protect themselves against the elements. They also, with the shortage of food, tried to make do with what they had. So they started to eat a lot of what they call fire cakes, which were the ashes from their fires. They would put together with a little water or snow, since it was winter, and try to heat them up and eat that as a small paste. It was very gross, not nutritious, actually detrimental to their health systems, but they were so desperate for food, they would eat whatever they had. So when they started out with 10,000 soldiers, 2,000 soldiers died, which again, the Continental Army was already undermanned. So the loss of 2,000 soldiers was something that was going to be a heavy cost to them. But it's important to reinforce that despite these hard conditions, despite not getting paid, despite the Continental Army not getting them the supplies they need, none of the soldiers desert. And George Washington roughed it out with them in Valley Forge. He could have easily been welcomed into a local home where he could have lived much more comfortably in the winter. But he stayed there amongst his men, kind of as that rallying point to keep them together. While they're in Valley Forge and in that harsh winter, the French are working feverishly to gather supplies and start sending their, members of their army and their navy to the defense of the colonies. And one such person is going to be Marquis de Lafayette. He was very passionate about the American cause for independence, and as a Frenchman, he was adamantly against the British. He is going to join Washington's staff at Valley Forge, so he's going to get to see firsthand the struggles and the lack of supplies that they have, and he's going to write back personally to the French government and French monarch to continue to bring those supplies to the colonists. So he lobbied for French reinforcement of troops, but also supplies. He will prove to be a pivotal point in the late 1780 and 1781, particularly at the Battle of Yorktown, which will bring an end to the Revolutionary War. Another individual who is going to be a key person in Valley Forge in that winter is going to be Baron Frederick von Steuben. Now, von Steuben was not French. He was Prussian, which will become Germany. But he was a very skilled captain and drill master. And so he, again, was supportive of the colonist cause, that he's going to lend his expertise to the colonies. So he's a volunteer. He taught the soldiers how to be soldiers. George Washington didn't have time to strategize and plan as well as train his troops and his captains. So von Steuben is going to step in to kind of take that off of Washington's plate and really create a sophisticated Continental Army. And so this brings us to what will be considered the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. After 1777, Washington and his troops, along with the planning of the French, decide that their interests would be better suited in the South. If New England was too heavily impacted by the number of British troops being in Massachusetts and in New York, and the fact that the British had control of Philadelphia. So because of the lack of manpower, it was better for them to try to attack the British presence in the South and economically start to hopefully force the British to try to surrender. And so they head south, they head into the Carolinas, and they start to create some skirmish there. There was a battle of Cowpens in the Carolinas. So we've got Nathaniel Greene kind of coming up from South Carolina and North Carolina. And then we're going to have George Washington coming down from Pennsylvania, starting to enclose on the British troops. And they trapped the British in Virginia. So they chose the little in-cut where Jamestown originally was established and settle in along the York River in Yorktown. So Cornwallis isolates himself there on the peninsula. He thinks he's well protected. The Americans, again, in the south and the north, start to march in and try to trap him in. What the British were not prepared for was the French fleet. So the French fleet is coming from the north. They start to steer course and take on the British ships that are supposed to be protecting Cornwallis in the peninsula there at the Chesapeake Bay, so that they can start sailing up the York and James rivers to surround the British troops. The French Navy will defeat the British fleet and block the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, ultimately preventing any other supplies or troop reinforcements from getting in the region. So this is where Washington and Lafayette, coming down from Pennsylvania, will surround the peninsula on land and begin bombarding Cornwallis day and night with shell fire, ultimately forcing Cornwallis to surrender. And so eventually his troops were outnumbered. He raises the white flag. Now this is not just the end of the Revolutionary War, but Cornwallis's defeat, when word gets back to Great Britain, this is where the British people lose support for the war because of how costly it's been. While the British had been fighting, the British citizens had seen their taxes go up and up and up to cover the cost of this conflict, to the point that many British citizens started to question, why are we fighting this? What's the point? If the colonists want to be independent, let them be independent. Why do we continue to have to pay higher taxes to keep a territory that doesn't want to be part of Great Britain? So the lack of British citizen support is ultimately what's going to push the British monarch to end the conflict and surrender. And so this begins the proceedings for the Treaty of Paris. 4 nations are going to meet in Paris, France: Great Britain, obviously the representatives of the Continental Army, and France and Spain. Now Spain is going to be part of this because Spain, they had a treaty with France, and if France showed their loyalty to the colonies, then Spain would in turn. So Spain's going to get a small chunk of land, but they did not have a big part in this conflict. So before they would even start to negotiate any type of land use or resources, the Continental Congress is going to be adamant about Great Britain recognizing the American independence. And so they would even begin talking with them. The Continental Congress sent John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams as the representatives for the colonists, because they have proven to be the most well-versed in politics and diplomacy for the colonies and have been very vocal amongst the members of the Continental Congress. So looking here at the map, we're going to start to look at some of the new land claims. So if you look there in the yellow, that is the Spanish land that they will get at the end of the Revolutionary War. So they maintain control of Spanish Florida, but they also get all of the land west of the Mississippi River. So that will be their area of influence. The British are going to have control of what is present-day Canada. Okay, so the Hudson Bay Territory up in the north. And so that carves out a new large chunk for the colonies that will become the United States. So once the American independence was acknowledged, then they began their talks. So the Treaty of Paris is going to be signed in 1783, but this proved that the colonists were rather naive in their diplomacy, because while they were happy that their independence was recognized, the things that they didn't consider was when the British were going to have to leave the colonies. The British had forts out in their new territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains. There was no set timeline when the British had to abandon those forts and go back to Great Britain. And so this is going to prove to be something that the colonists should have dealt with during this treaty process. But ultimately, America will now be the East Coast all the way up to the Mississippi River and border of Canada to Florida. So Spanish territory will be west of the Mississippi River, and British territory will be north in Canada. Now, some people are wondering, what about the French? Why didn't they get any land? Well, eventually the Spanish are going to give up their claims of land west of the Mississippi, and that will become French territory within North America.